On the night of the 14th of May, 1977, a British Army captain walked into a pub 3 miles from the Irish border, alone, with no backup, no cover team, and no good reason to be there. His name was Robert Nairac. He was a Grenadier Guards officer, Ampleforth and Oxford, a boxer, attached to British intelligence work in the most dangerous square miles in Western Europe. That night he was using the name of a dead man and singing a Republican ballad to a room full of people, some of whom knew exactly who and what he was. When he walked out to the car park after 11 o'clock, he was set upon by a group of men, beaten and forced into a car. He was driven across the border into the Republic to a field near Ravensdale, and there he was interrogated through the night and shot. He told them nothing. His body was never found. The man convicted of his murder said the IRA never recovered it either. 47 years later, Robert Nairac is still out there, somewhere in the border country he died trying to understand. We have told the beginning of this story before. In our film on the unit that did not officially exist, the one most people call 14 Intelligence Company, the cold open is a man in a brown leather jacket walking out of a pub called the 3 Steps into a car park where 7 men are waiting. That was the doorway into the unit. This is what happened after he walked through it. This is the death, the trials, the medal, and the half-century of silence that followed, told from the documentary record rather than the legend. Because the legend has had Robert Nairac for 47 years, and the record has barely had a chance. Begin with the man, because the man is harder to find than the myth. Robert Lawrence Nairac was born on the 31st of August, 1948. He was educated at Ampleforth, the Benedictine school in Yorkshire, and then at Lincoln College, Oxford, where he read history. He was a Catholic, which mattered in the war he ended up fighting. He boxed for the university, he kept hawks, he was a falconer, genuinely, not as an affectation. He was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards in 1972 and made captain on the 4th of September 1975. People who knew him reached almost without exception for the same words: charming, fearless, physically formidable, a little theatrical. The fullest portrait of him is in John Parker's 1999 book, Death of a Hero, Captain Robert Nairac, GC, written with the cooperation of senior army figures and of Nairac's own friends and family. Parker's account of the conspiracy theories is contradictory in places, and reviewers have said so. But on the man himself it is vivid. A Catholic golden boy, Oxford educated, recruited into the Shadow War, a romantic and something of a loner who came over 4 tours to love the country he was sent to watch. The George Cross citation, the most official sentence ever written about him, put it more plainly. His quick analytical brain, resourcefulness, physical stamina, and above all his courage and dedication, inspired admiration in everyone who knew him. That is the state's own verdict, and we will come back to it. But it leaves a great deal out. What it leaves out is how he worked. Over 4 tours of Northern Ireland, totalling 28 months, Nairac became something the British Army had only recently invented and never entirely controlled. A lone officer operating in the grey country between soldiering and spying. He learnt the accents. He drank in the pubs. He moved on his own through areas where a uniformed patrol could not stay still for 90 seconds. And the men who knew what he actually was have, almost to a man, refused to talk about it. Which is part of why the record on him is so thin and the rumour so thick. To understand what he was doing on his last night, you have to understand the ground. South Armagh, in the middle of the 1970s, was the most concentrated zone of danger in the Troubles. Soldiers called it bandit country, and the name stuck hard enough that the journalist Toby Harnden used it for the title of the standard book on the place. Bandit Country, the IRA and South Armagh, published in 1999. The provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade was rural, tight-knit, often family-based, and extremely good at the one thing that mattered: making the British Army's normal methods impossible. Ordinary foot patrols drew fire from across hedgerows and from across the border itself, a border that was, in places, a line in a field you could step over in a second. Convoys were so exposed that much of the Army's movement in the area shifted to helicopters. In country like that, conventional patrolling buys you very little. And so the war went underground, into surveillance, into informers, into men like Nairac who could pass. And this is where the record stops being simple. Because depending on which source you believe, Nairac belonged to one of three things, and the dispute over which has never been settled. Officially, he was attached to 4 Field Survey Troop Royal Engineers, a deliberately boring name for a subunit of the Special Duties outfit, usually called 14 Intelligence Company. On his 4th and final tour, his title was Liaison Officer at the headquarters of 3 Infantry Brigade, and the George Cross citation says plainly that his task was connected with surveillance operations. Popular accounts simply call him an SAS officer. But SAS veterans themselves push back on that. Ken Connor, who served in the regiment, said that had Nairac been an actual SAS member, he would not have been allowed to operate the way he did, adding that before his death, the regiment had been worried about the lack of checks on his activities, because no one seemed to know who his boss was. Major Clive Fairweather, who held a senior intelligence post in the province, said flatly that Nairac was never an SAS man, attached to their world, working alongside it, but not of it. We are not going to resolve that here, because it cannot be resolved from the open record. State the dispute and leave it standing. 14 Intelligence, SAS attached, or Liaison Officer. What is not in dispute is that he was operating with a degree of independence that alarmed even the people whose job was independence. So picture the last evening, reconstructed not from the legend, but from the trial evidence and the official citation. On the evening of the 14th of May, 1977, Captain Nairac signed out of Bessbrook Mill, the fortified base near Newry, at 25 minutes past 9. He was due back by 11:30. He drove alone in a civilian car to the village of Druminty and to the pub called the 3 Steps Inn, 3 miles from the border. He had been there before. That night he was carrying the identity of a man called Danny McAlane, a motor mechanic, supposedly, an official IRA man from the Ardoyne in Belfast. He had a cover story and an accent to go with it. He sang with the band. He stayed for hours. The documentary record establishes only this: that a single British officer spent the evening of his life inside a crowded room in the most hostile parish in the country, alone, performing a Republican from another city, while at least some of the people around him grew certain that he was not what he claimed to be. Sometime after 11 o'clock, it came apart in the car park. The accounts that reach the courts describe a challenge, one of the men, Terry McCormick, squaring up to him, a punch, a fall, and then a metallic sound that made McCormick believe the stranger was carrying a weapon. He called the others in. What followed took several men and several minutes. Nairac fought. The citation, choosing its words carefully, speaks of his fierce resistance. But the numbers were against him, and there was no one coming. A covered British party was, by some accounts, no more than 100 yards away, and they did not move, because the radio he was carrying could not reach them. He was overpowered, put into a car, and driven the short distance south across the border into the Republic of Ireland. The pub was called the Three Steps. The village was called Drumintee, and the line he was carried across that night was the same line his whole career had been spent trying to read. What happened on the other side of it is the part the record handles most carefully, and we will too. He was taken to a field at Ravensdale in the north of County Louth, wooded ground a few miles inside the Republic. There, through the dark hours, he was questioned. The George Cross citation describes a succession of exceptionally savage assaults intended to extract information that would have put other lives and future operations at serious risk. The trial evidence later spoke of him being struck repeatedly, with fists, with a weapon, with a wooden post. And here the official record and the human story line up exactly. These efforts to break Captain Nairac's will, the citation says, failed entirely. Weakened in strength, but not in spirit, he made repeated attempts to escape, and each time was dragged back by the weight of numbers. He never confirmed who he was. He never gave up his unit or his sources. There is an account, told by McCormick, that at one point Nairac, faced with a man pretending to be a priest, answered with the words, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." But that rests on a single teller, and we flag it as an account rather than a fact. What is not in dispute is how it ended. After several hours, a gunman was summoned to the field. A young man named Liam Townsend, 24 years old, from the village of May near Newry, the son of an English father and an Irish mother. The captain was shot. And then the second thing happened, the thing that turned a death into a haunting. The body went, and it did not come back. By the time the search for him began, Robert Nairac was already gone. Not buried in any place anyone would name, not handed over, not recovered. He had been missing for less than a day, and he has been missing ever since. The investigation that followed ran on both sides of the border, which was itself unusual. In the Republic, the Gardaí arrested Liam Townsend, and Townsend confessed. His statement is the closest thing this story has to a human document from the other side, and it is worth giving in his own words. He told them, "I shot the British captain. He never told us anything. He was a great soldier." That is the man who did it, describing the man it was done to. In November 1977, in the Special Criminal Court in Dublin, Townsend was convicted in connection with the death and sentenced to life. He served 13 years and was released in 1990. North of the border, the Royal Ulster Constabulary worked the other end of the case, and in 1978 a second set of trials produced more convictions. Gerard Fearon, 21, and Thomas Morgan, 18, were convicted on the most serious count. Daniel O'Rourke, 33, was convicted of manslaughter and jailed for 10 years. Michael McCoy, 20, got 5 years for the abduction. Owen Rocks, 22, got 2 years for withholding information. Years later, in 2008, a man named Kevin Crilly was arrested and eventually tried. He was cleared in 2011, when the court found the prosecution had not proved he knew what was going to happen. That is the legal record. By the count of the courts, several men answered for that night on both sides of the border. And yet, set against the weight of it, the abduction, the field, the loss of a life, The sentences ran out long ago. Townsend was free by 1990. The convictions established who was in the car park and who was in the field. They did not establish the one thing the family has wanted for half a century. And yet the central fact of the case was never resolved, and it is the fact that defines everything that came after. The trials established who. They did not establish where. The body was never produced, not at the trials, not afterward, not in the half-century since. The accounts of what was done with it conflict, and we give them as claims, not findings. One man involved, McCormick, is said to have been told by a senior IRA figure that the body was first buried on farmland and then moved and reburied somewhere else. Another strand, the one that has done the most damage to the truth, holds that the body was destroyed entirely, fed, the rumour says, into an industrial mincer at a meat plant. That second story is almost certainly false. The forensic investigator who later led the search for him, Jeff Knupfer, called the meat grinder rumour a distraction and said plainly, "We believe he is buried somewhere in North County Louth." What happened next is where the documentary trail fins. The men who could end it have not. And in 2025, an IRA source told reporters that Nairac's body would never be located. On the 13th of February 1979, almost 2 years after the field at Ravensdale, the London Gazette carried the announcement that Captain Robert Lawrence Nairac of the Grenadier Guards had been awarded the George Cross. It is the highest award for gallantry not in the face of the enemy, the civilian and behind-the-lines equivalent of the Victoria Cross, and it was posthumous. The citation reconstructs the last night in formal language. The abduction from a village in South Armagh by at least 7 men. The journey across the border, the savage assaults, the refusal to break. And it ends with a sentence that is, in its way, the most extraordinary thing the British state has ever put on paper about a moment it did not witness. His assassin, the citation records, subsequently said, "He never told us anything." The state took the word of the man who had done it and engraved it into the highest honour it had to give. Townsend's confession and the official citation, written from opposite ends of the war, agree on the one point that mattered. He told them nothing. That, by rights, should be the whole of the story. The soldier, the silence, the medal. But a missing body does something to a story. It leaves a vacuum, and into that vacuum, over 40 years, poured a second Nairac. A figure who has almost nothing to do with the one in the court records. This is the part where we have to be most careful, because it is the part the internet most enjoys. In the years after his death, Nairac was named, by a handful of former intelligence men and self-described insiders, as the secret hand behind a string of attacks he had nothing provable to do with. The ambush of the Miami show band in 1975, the bombings in Dublin and Monaghan, the violence around Kingsmill. The myth made him a master conspirator, a one-man dirty war. We name those claims here only to set them down, because the documented record does not support them. The same forensic investigator who searched for his body, Jeff Knupfer, went through the allegations one by one. At the time of the Miami show band attack, the record places Nairac either finishing duty with the Grenadier Guards in London or already travelling to a fishing holiday in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. At the time of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, he was on a course in Kent. At the time of the Kingsmill attack, he was preparing for training at Pirbright in England. A survivor of the Miami show band attack, shown a photograph, could not identify Nairac as the man he remembered. Knupfer's blunt assessment was that these false stories were a key reason the search for the real Nairac was so hard. They had poisoned the well and made the people who might know where he lies less willing to come forward. So we set the myth aside, not because it flatters him to do so, but because it is not true, and because the audience for this channel has made it very clear that what they want is the man, not the legend. What is true is harder and quieter. Robert Nairac was a real officer, doing real and dangerous work in a system that had built a category of soldier it could neither fully supervise nor fully protect. The lone, half-deniable man sent into a war he was never completely briefed for. The same independence that made him effective is the independence that worried the SAS. The independence that meant a covered party 100 yards away could not reach him. The independence that put him alone in that car park with a failing radio. His death is the human cost of that experiment, written very small. 1 man, 1 field, 1 night. And the missing body is what turned that small, true thing into 40 years of something else. So return at the end to the ground where it happened, because the ground is the only thing left to return to. The 3 steps in still stands in Drumintee. The border he was carried across is, since the peace, just a road again. Somewhere in the wooded country around Ravensdale in North County Louth, the search has gone on, in fits and starts, for nearly 50 years. In the autumn of 2024, the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains, the body set up by the British and Irish governments to recover the people the conflict made disappear, dug a small piece of ground at Forhart near Dundalk, less than an acre, the first formal search ever undertaken for him. They found nothing. When they stood the dig down that October, the commissioners said only that it was bitterly disappointing. He remains, as of now, one of just 4 of the disappeared whose remains have never been found. The forensic record establishes that he is almost certainly there, in that border country, and not where the rumours put him. It cannot yet establish exactly where. Robert Nairac was 28 years old. He had been warned more than once that the way he worked would get him killed. And it did. He was awarded the George Cross for telling his interrogators nothing through the last night of his life. He has no grave, because his body was never given back, not to the army, not to his family, not to anyone. Somewhere in the border country between Armagh and Louth, in a landscape he spent his short career trying to read, Captain Robert Nairac is still missing. He is the only George Cross holder of the entire conflict whose family was never able to bury him. One correction, in the spirit of telling this straight. That last line is how the story is most often told, and it carries the weight of the thing. The verifiable part is exact. Nairac's body was never recovered, and he stands among the disappeared of the Troubles, one of only 4 still unfound, with the George Cross to his name. Whether he is literally the single George Cross holder of the conflict to lie in an unmarked place, we could not confirm against the full record, and we will not assert as certain what we cannot show. What we can say without qualification is this. Of all the awards for courage the conflict produced, none was given to a man whose family was left so completely without him, without a body, without a grave, without an ending. The medal is in the records. The man is still in the field.